Bob Vylan's pro-Palestinian Glastonbury set has set the proverbial cat amongst the pigeons on the British right, with some in the establishment more offended that he called for death against the IDF than that he gloated the English will never get their country back. I think this will be a dividing line going forward between the parochial and younger right-wing versus the establishment conservatives. Plus, Sajid Javid has a new independent commission on community and cohesion seeking to cover up the complicity of his own government's immigration and multicultural policy in building the febrile environment that led to the Southport riots last summer. And all that and more this week on Tomlinson Talks. So Irish Republican rap group Kneecap had their thunder stolen at Glastonbury Festival over the weekend because they, fresh off of praising Hezbollah and calling to assassinate MPs, and then finally being investigated by the police who dragged their heels to do so. Meanwhile, Lucy Connolly is in prison for 31 months for a tweet that she deleted that in no way incited violence, especially not to the scale that Kneecap did. Kneecap, despite, again, glorifying terrorism and calling to start a riot outside their pending trial in Westminster, they were overshadowed by a rap group called Bob Vylan. Now, the lead lyricist of Bob Vylan is called Pascal Robinson-Foster, a typical middle-class hyphenated surname. He's the son of, I believe, a Jamaican man and an English woman, and he got up and chanted before a Palestine flag and a sort of slur against the native population, saying this country was built on the backs of immigrants. He got up and chanted, "I hear you want your country back. No, you can't have that. Shut the F up." And then crowd surfed to throngs, thousands of white middle-class English people chanting along with him, cheering for their own dispossession in their own country, cheering for ethnic vengeance and anti-white racism directed at them as much as it is against the gammon working class, and he uses the word gammon in his song that was put out years ago. Now, Vylan also went on and chanted death to the IDF. He also went on a spiel about working for Zionists. Turns out that he was represented by the United Talent Agency before they dropped him for this set, of course, and as it's the music industry, there are quite a number of Jewish people involved in the United Talent Agency, and they were a bit uncomfortable about his anti-Semitism, to put it mildly. But what Bob Vylan has revealed is a number of untruths lying at the heart of the post-war project that is post-1948, post-Attlee, Commonwealth-era Great Britain. The first is that Britain is a nation of immigrants. Now, Barbara Roach, the Blair immigration minister, said this in a speech, I think it was in 2000, in September, at the Institute for Public Policy Research, which was Blair's sort of favourite think tank, and she had appropriated it from John F. Kennedy's book for the Anti-Defamation League, which is titled A Nation of Immigrants, which was published, I think in the late 50s or the 60s. And this was to build the post-war impression that America was a pluralistic, liberal nation that could unite all ethnicities and religion under the civic nationalist banner of American identity. And this is why, even though he was on the ostensible left, he is famous for the phrase, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." It was an anti-socialist slogan, but it encompassed all of these identities into the conception of the melting pot under the banner of American national identity. And what Tony Blair tried to do is try to reconfigure Britain from being an old world ethnic-based settlement nation into a social contract civic nationalist nation. This is why he instituted the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act and made the civil service neutral or impartial, and this meant that the civil service is now positioned above the government and acts as a kind of permanent bureaucracy that actually governs Britain. That's why he introduced the Supreme Court, and that's why he introduced the concept of British values, which is a kind of creed that anyone from anywhere can sign up to and either be a Brit in waiting or as soon as their souls touch British soil, as long as they've signed up to the Scout's Pledge of Values, properly codified under Michael Gove at the Department for Education in 2014 as, I think it was, democracy, tolerance, the rule of law, bland, universalist, liberal beliefs. As long as they sign up to that, they are as indistinguishably British as Hengist and Horsa and Henry VIII, even if retroactively our own ancestors didn't live up to that modish modern standard of what it means to be British. Now, point being, this is all built on a fundamental lie. Britain is not a nation of immigrants. It never has been. We have been relatively stable and unaffected by large-scale migration from between the Norman conquests of 1066 and the Second World War. The Norman conquests of 1066, by the way, only ever added about 5% to the population at the time, and their genetic imprint on Britain is only ever about 1%. What the Norman conquest was, it replaced the upper echelons of the governing class in England. So it replaced the monarchy. And this is why you have that famous Kipling poem of a Norman on his deathbed telling his son and bequeathing to him the governance of England, don't mess with the Anglo-Saxon because he's at his plough, he is quiet, but if he is perturbed, you will feel his wrath. And that is because the Normans were vastly outnumbered by the Anglo-Saxons, and they didn't mix in nearly as much as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes did with the Britons and Celts that were already here in the Roman period when those German tribes migrated over. I think it was in the 5th or 6th century. And then after that, obviously, the Venerable Bede decided to write out the history of the English and define them as a distinct people. That was in 731 AD. And then, obviously, Athelstan, the first king of England, in 927 AD. Aside from that period of 1066 right through to 1945, aside from a handful of Huguenots and Dutch Protestants and a few Jews that were allowed back under, I think it was Charles II and Oliver Cromwell, other than that, Britain has never been a nation of immigrants. The population from 1927 were more than 90% related to the population of 927. We have a remarkably stable stock of families, of ancestry, of people in England before the revolutions in 1948, 1997 and 2021, before the Attlee, Blair and Boris governments, before the 1948 British Nationality Act, which opened up our borders to Commonwealth migration after the HMS Windrush arrived in Essex, wasn't invited, by the way, despite the modern narrative that it was, before the election of Tony Blair, when something happened and the European Union, the expansion of the Schengen zone led to an explosion in the number of migrants when they only estimated it was going to be something like 30,000. It ended up being a few million. And before the Boris wave, post-Brexit, when Priti Patel went against the advice of even the pro-migration Migration Advisory Committee and established an uncapped pathway for health and social care workers to come to Britain, bring limitless numbers of dependents. Zimbabwean workers were outnumbered 10 to 1 by their dependents, Ghanaians 4 to 1 and Nigerians 2 to 1, and obviously set the skilled worker visa threshold for their income lower than that of the average British salary. It was almost at minimum wage level, so it's hardly skilled workers. Before all of those things, Britain was remarkably homogenous, culturally, demographically. It was a succession of families, a great chain of civilization that passed down an inheritance of culture and custom and land and a sense of belonging from father to son, mother to daughter for over 1,000 years. And so this settlement has been recently disrupted by those demographic revolutions, by Windrush, by Blair, by Boris. And in order to force the British to be accommodating of those unwanted waves of demographic and thereby cultural change and the economic costs and rise in crime associated with all of that, we have refashioned our national mythology to be, rather than Hengist and Horsa, William the Conqueror versus Harold Hardrada and Harold Godwinson, and Henry VIII, rather than those sort of revolutions within England, those battles, those revolutions among the elite governing class, rather than all that, we've acted as if the Windrush showed up as Britain's Mayflower and settled this windswept isle and built the NHS, and ever since we've been a healthcare system with a country attached. And Sam Ashworth-Hayes wrote in The Telegraph recently, because pretty much every party that has governed or hopes to govern has bought into this narrative. I mean, I already mentioned Barbara Roach from the Blair government, Keir Starmer in his recent Island of Strangers speech, in which he now has denounced, but we'll get onto that later. He said that now in a diverse nation like ours, and I celebrate that, these rules become even more important. Migration is part of Britain's national story. We talked last week about the great rebuilding of this country after the war. Migrants were part of that, and they make a massive contribution today. You will never hear me denigrate that. By the way, only 3% of the Boris wave are doctors and nurses, and they commit much higher rates of qualifications fraud and medical malpractice than, native and British-born doctors and nurses. And also, only 5% of visas given out every year are to net taxpayers. The rest are net tax dependents, and that includes skilled workers. That includes, obviously, health and social care and NHS workers, because they're paid for by the taxpayer and don't actually contribute back more in kind than they take. So that's a myth. Remember, during the last Conservative government, Michael Gove got up at the Dispatch box when he was announcing his definition of extremism, I think it was in March 2024, and said, quote, "The United Kingdom is a success story, a multinational, multi-ethnic and multi-faith democracy, stronger because of our diversity." No, the research from the likes of Robert Putnam has been in for over 20 years. Diversity has a deleterious effect on social trust, and the only thing that goes up with diversity is staying at home watching TV or going out in the streets and rioting or protesting over sectarian, ethnic and political grievances. So diversity is at best our entertainment, at worst our downfall, as we can see from Bob Vylan. And then recently, Reform UK, their brand new chairman, Dr. David Bull, decided to say immigration is the lifeblood of this country, it always has been, and that we are an island of immigrants. And when he was pressed on this, he tried to back it up by saying, well, I mean the well-integrated ones like the Jews and the Huguenots. Now, don't get me wrong, those groups have, sure, contributed plenty of things to Britain. I can't sit there and list them all off the top of my head, but I'm sure they have contributed positively. Hey, I've got a bunch of Jewish friends, I work in politics, it happens. However, if they had not come here, if the Huguenots had stayed in France and the Jews had stayed in Europe and not been persecuted by the Nazis, of course, or they had always kept Israel as their own and the Second Temple hadn't fallen, if Britain did not have waves of Huguenot, Jewish, few thousand Chinese immigrants over the years, who are relatively low levels of troublemaking and disruption, right? If they did not have that, Britain would still be a great country. To say diversity is our strength, to say we are a nation of immigrants, to say that it's only because of immigrants we clambered our way out of the rubble and rations of the Second World War, is a slur against the native population of this country. And it is doing the work of stoking ethnic and historical grievances held by the likes of Bob Vylan. And Bob Vylan single-handedly shatters the illusion that the nation of immigrants narrative has worked to integrate people, even who have an English parent, because he clearly identifies as non-English. He identifies as an ethnic minority. He identifies as presumably just black or Afro-Caribbean. And he holds a grudge against the native people of this country. And he is declaring that he sees his music and his political activism as an act of imperial conquest, that he is delighting in the dispossession of the English people of their own land when they have never done anything to him. I mean, they quite literally took in his dad. His mum fell in love with his dad. I don't know if they're still together. They had a son. They raised him in relative peace and prosperity. In fact, the only decline in prosperity and disruption to civic peace has largely been because of the importing of net tax dependents and men from nations that are far more likely to commit violent and sexual crimes than the native population, like places like Jamaica or the Horn of Africa or the Middle East, Pakistan, Turkey. I mean, just take your pick. Anywhere that basically isn't East Asia, West Europe, and the Anglosphere. Never contributes in taxes and usually leads to a rise in violent crime. All of that doesn't prompt Bob Vylan to be grateful. it prompts him to buy into the false narrative that Britain is a nation of immigrants, and therefore, like American slaves, even though, of course, Britain has existed for well over 1,000 years with very low levels of immigration, and the Windrush happened in less than the last 80 years, but it's treated like an original racial sin for Britain because the new founding was the Second World War and the establishment of the NHS. He uses that narrative pushed by Blair, Brown, Cameron, Boris, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, and now even Reform as a casus belli to deprive the English of a claim to their own country, because contained within that lie are multiple premises. Number one, that the English do not exist as a distinct group. You are just the sort of aggregated mongrels of anyone from anywhere who happened to turn up on this land, which means that you are not the product of a particular ancestry, you're not the product of a particular people who made a set of distinct decisions that other people in other places did not, which led to the consequences of today, which should inspire in you gratitude to uphold all of their sacrifices, to participate in the democracy of the dead, of tradition, as Chesterton said. Instead, you are just an arbitrary atom who's bounced around by the forces of history, and anyone from anywhere who came to this land could have made the exact same set of decisions. Therefore, anyone from anywhere who comes to this land now has not only an equal claim to your country, your heritage, your culture, and defining it, as well as living off of its dwindling largesse from state redistribution, but also because you are not a product of this distinct continuity, you are not entitled to feel aggrieved and dispossessed when you notice a downgrading in your status as a member of the host majority, as David Betts would say. When you notice that your government is legislating to deprive you of opportunities and instead reallocate resources, power, wealth, privilege, status to tribal, ethnic, and religious minorities. When your government is giving millions in private security protections to mosques, when it is inviting the community leaders of various ethnic and religious groups to meetings in Downing Street, when the Charities Act, the Companies Act, the Equalities Act, and the Sentencing Council judicial guidance that very nearly passed until the intervention by Robert Jenrick forced the hand of Shabana Mahmood, when you notice that all of these pieces of legislation essentially commit an apartheid against straight white men in this country, if you notice all of that, then you yourself are a racist because you are trying to draw arbitrary distinctions between people who could have always come to this land, could have always recreated the exact same country, and who have just as much a right to call this country their own as you. That is the opinion of the state. However, that is not the opinion of their foot soldiers. What the opinion of their foot soldiers, like Bob Vylan, is a sort of reveling in you feeling like a stranger in your own home, like you feeling like a second-class citizen in your own country. They carry a lot of civilizational, ethnic, and historical baggage, and they, rather than choosing to recognize our differences and foster friendly relations between peoples, as presumably the Huguenots and the Jews back then did, they choose to pick a fight with us. And because the state is on their side, even though they're accusing the state of being institutionally racist, but they only do that to amass and accrue more power because the state, all of the middle-class leftists that go to Glastonbury have a guilty conscience as liberals because they fundamentally agree with the revolutionary goals of the likes of Bob Vylan. Because they have that guilty conscience, they leverage claims of racism and discrimination against a state that already agrees with them to amass more power, and so their takeover of this country is sponsored by the state. And so this completely shatters the delusion that Britain is a nation of immigrants, that anyone from anywhere could have built it, and that assimilation is, as Fraser Nelson once said, a miracle underway in Britain. No. Imported tribalistic minorities truly believe themselves to be the enemy of the native host majority population. Again, not all, but this is a constant. And they have throngs of useful idiot white leftists cheering them on and passing them overhead as they crowd surf, just as the attendants at Glastonbury have passed a dinghy full of mannequins in life jackets overhead to celebrate the fact that thousands of fighting age males who market our women and girls filmed without their consent, drunk and in states of undress by Islamic standards on social media to entice potential predators to come over here. They celebrate the fact that that's happening, even though we know from the Casey report that now some of those illegal migrants are participating in historic grooming gangs that have happened up and down the country. They are celebrating this. They are celebrating this violence committed against the white British because they are white British. And yet, and this is the important point, and yet, the ostensible right wing in this country did not take umbrage with that. They took umbrage with the chants of death to the IDF. Now, allow me to say, I don't think it is a good thing, of course, to chant death to the IDF, though I'm pretty sure that Israel's incredibly competent military, who have been waging their defensive war against Hamas, Hezbollah, and all of Iran's proxies for a couple of years now, are capable of defending themselves without British MPs getting on television and doing it for them. Now, if said MPs, like Danny Kruger, who went on Newsnight to condemn Bob Vylan for his anti-Semitism, but who at the Now and England conference last week joined Robert Toombs in being befuddled as to why Zoomers were asking questions about demographics, the hijacking of multiculturalism by sectarian Islamists, and the unlikelihood of mass-scale integration after mass immigration. Danny Kruger couldn't really define what an Englishman is, but was and remains very perturbed that people would like to see the state of Israel destroyed. Now, Israel's state is taking the side of its people. Danny, your job as a parliamentarian is to take our side. And you aren't, because you didn't bring up the chance of, heard you want your country back. No, you can't have that. The racial and ethnic vitriol directed at the English, platformed on the BBC, and yet most of the complaints about the BBC platforming Bob Vylan, most of the complaints about Bob Vylan himself, or themselves, they're a duo, not that anyone's going to go and listen to them now, most of the complaints revolve around their anti-Semitism and their contempt for Israel and the IDF. I would like to say two things on this. First of all, I don't think, despite the chants of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, inshallah, I don't think that Bob Vylan has a deep and abiding understanding of the long and contentious situation in Israel, Gaza, and Palestine. I don't think he's an expert on Middle Eastern politics. I think Palestine has become the leftist omnicause because it is a vector for anti-white hatred and anti-Western hatred. This is why the Greens have so eagerly assimilated into this movement. It's why Greta Thunberg has gone from skipping school to complain about climate change to striking on her University of Stockholm campus wearing keffiyeh and getting deported from Israel as she joined some convoy to sail to Palestine across the Mediterranean. This is why the Green Party has been completely subsumed by Islamists and their councillor, Mohsin Ali, who said that his victory was a win for Palestine and shouted Allahu Akbar, which I presume is Arabic for recycling, is now running to be leader after about a year of being a councillor. This is why the Islamists are in coalition with Queers for Palestine and sexual revolutionary liberals who would go from the top of a skyscraper to the pavement were they to spend any time in Palestine. A lot of the Palestinian liberation cause is just window dressing for anti-white hatred. And this is what Bob Vylan has done. Bob Vylan, I don't think, has a deep and complex understanding of the conflict in the Middle East. I think he just wouldn't shed a tear if the atrocities of October 7th that happened at a music festival much like Glastonbury were to be repeated and perpetrated against the indigenous white British. And we know Hamas would like to do that because, as the Iranians also, curse Britain as well, they believe the British are responsible for establishing the State of Israel by handing over the mandate of Palestine to create the state in 1948. And they also believe that they are responsible for toppling the former Iranian regime to install the Shah and try to create some sort of puppet government that then the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the Ayatollahs took over in the 79 revolution. They blame Britain for a hell of a lot, and so they would like to perpetrate the same heinous crimes as they did against Israel in 2023 against Britain in the future, given half a chance. And our porous border is allowing Iranian sleeper cells and Afghani sex criminals to pore over and commit those abuses against our women and girls. And we've already seen those abuses happen, and our government took the side of the terrorists. I'm thinking, of course, of the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing, where Raiku, the Home Office unit, told the entire country, don't look back in anger, as the bodies of young girls lied on a mortician slab and their poor parents had to identify them. And we've, of course, had the grooming gangs, which local councillors, police officers, politicians, and the media covered up for decades because of the race, and particularly the religion as well, of the perpetrators. So we have had similar abuses, as October 7th, perpetrated against the indigenous white British for a very long time. Our state has taken the side of the terrorists and the perpetrators, and now our right-wing ecosystem, the patriots in the media, are more concerned about speaking up in the defense of Israel than for Britain. And a lot of this is because we revolve around the gravity well, again, of the Second World War as a kind of negative foundation myth, as the European Union wrote in their proposing of a unified European history curriculum about a year or so ago. Which means that every European nation and America must do all it can to be an open society, as R.R. Reno has written about, Return of the Strong Gods. It must do all it can to basically avoid being Hitler. It's what Ralph Scholhammer says our elites tell themselves, like what would Jesus do? They go, what would Hitler do? And then do the opposite. And so they have to be pathologically open to anyone from anywhere coming into this country. They have to deny cultural differences. They can't put up any hard boundaries between people, place, preference, history, culture, because that's akin to racism, and the greatest sin now is to be a racist, because the Nazis killed lots and lots of Jews and they did it because of racism. Whereas the state of Israel can be very concerned as a matter of national security about the homogeneity of its people, the dominance of its religion, its birth rates, its military defense. It can have a big, beautiful border wall. It can have a lot of things that we should envy and emulate. And that's not to say they have it at our expense, but I do think that is the core of a lot of antagonism towards Israel on the right. I personally am apathetic because, as Douglas Murray would say, I haven't been. But I do think noticing that contradiction between a sort of proud state that is a higher level of ethnic and religious consciousness over in the Middle East, for whom our politicians speak in the defense of. I mean, Nigel Farage once said, if the Jews are to survive as a race, we have to defend Israel. But he doesn't speak about that for the English.
Support of Israel and their right to defend themselves, but they have to do this. They simply have no option if they are to survive as a country and, frankly, in many ways, as a race in that part of the world.
He says that he's unbothered by demographic change. So does Richard Tice. So do a lot of Tory politicians who have facilitated these mass waves of immigration. And so when someone stands on the stage at the largest music festival in Britain and gloats about stealing the country from the native white British, they don't mention it as much as his comments wishing death upon the IDF. Again, they're bad. I don't want to see my Jewish friends mistreated while in this country. But if this, let's just say, if this pro-Palestinian regime is running the country, does have such a stranglehold over British political life, brings streets to a standstill every week, and makes it unsafe for Jewish people, and as a politician, for some reason, your preoccupation is the continued security of the Jewish community in Britain rather than prioritizing the interests of the British host majority first and foremost, and then their friendly and aligned minorities secondarily. If you are chiefly concerned about the security and safety of Jews in Britain, wouldn't you be more worried about the fact that a pro-Palestine coalition is declaring that they own this country and that the state broadcaster is putting it out and subsidizing their performance? Wouldn't you be worried that thousands of middle-class professionals and civil servants are allowing him to crowd surf and cheering that on? Wouldn't you be worried that we're entirely occupied by a regime that chants songs that sound a hell of a lot like Kill the Boer from Julius Malema's rallies in South Africa, directed, yes, at Jews, but also the native white British population. Wouldn't you be worried about that? Because that would also secure the continued safety of Jews living in Britain. And it's just strange to me that we can only coach our concerns in those terms. Like, I think it's because the Second World War, again, acts as a kind of gravity well around which all of politics orbits. And I just want to say, guys, we can just say that the types like Bob Vylan, they hate white people. They really hate white people. Like, it's not much more complicated than that. They don't have an incredibly nuanced take on Palestinian liberation. They have a very surface level, skin deep hatred of white people. It's demented. It's evil. It's just as objectionable as some skinhead who wants to beat up a black person because of their skin color without knowing them properly. We can't just turn around and say that. We can just say, they're anti-white racists. We shouldn't have to put up with this. This man has declared his intent to act as a kind of ambassador for an insurgent occupying political force that wants to steal our country from us. And okay, if he doesn't consider himself a member of our national tribe because he's saying to us, heard you want your country back, and acts as if he is in possession of it and is vindictive towards us, then we can say, okay, take your pick of another country around the world. We're going to revoke your citizenship per the Shamima Begum precedent that was set by depriving her of her citizenship because it wasn't conducive to the public good, and we'll just send you there because we don't have to put up with it. Guys, we can just say that. Because what are they going to do? They're going to scream and they're going to cry and they're going to call you racist, and you just turn around and go, no, we don't have the same definition of that term. I don't agree with what you're saying. I think he's actually an anti-white racist. I think he really hates me. And I don't have to put up with this genocidal rhetoric, actually. I don't have to put up with someone gloating and expressing glee at the fact they've stolen my country from me. I don't have to do that. We don't have to. We don't have to coach our terms, our objections to this hatred of us and our way of life in purely defense of a foreign land, Israel. We don't have to express any hatred toward the Israelis. Again, I'm pretty apathetic on the entire conflict. I just simply like the precedent they set of defending their people and their country against jihadists, and I wish my state would do the same for me against the fifth columnists that are currently at Home Office, the perpetrators of the Pakistani grooming gangs, etc. We can just object to Bob Dylan on the grounds of he really, really hates the English and white people and would like to see them mistreated, banished from their own country. And we do not have to accept that as an inevitability. As David Betts said at an event at the Unheard Club on Tuesday, I had the privilege of talking with him, and he's a very insightful man, but he said, look, he doesn't want civil war, even though he's been warning about it repeatedly, and the reason he's been warning about it is to try and encourage our clod-eared elites to walk us back from the precipice of it. But he said, there really are only two options here. It's a binary choice. Either Britain ceases to be a nation with over 1,000 years of continuity. It ceases to be, as George Orwell said in The Lion and the Unicorn, a distinct group of people, a culture, a place that if you transported yourself back from 1948 to 1848, you would see they're the same civilization. Either it ceases to be that, or it doesn't. And I say we wage a political war of self-defense against the likes of Bob Vylan and all of those who agree with him and chant his insidious anti-white slogans. We ensure that that person does not ever feel like he owns our country before, in fact, he can credibly say that he does. Unfortunately, none of our ostensibly right-wing elite seem to be taking that position. Speaking of inadequate solutions, Sajjad Javid, the former Home Secretary, has launched a new independent commission on community and cohesion to apparently explore the underlying divisions and tensions that led to the riots following the Southport massacre last summer. But when you investigate the organisations and members of said board, you'll realise it's just another cover-up in waiting. It's in no way independent. It is another front for state-funded actors to launder their preconceived conclusions through. And all it's going to say is we need more efforts to combat Islamophobia, more top-down directed assimilation efforts to enforce British values on the host population and imported tribal minorities alike, more liquidation of British identity to encompass its antonyms, and more online censorship. So the members of this committee, its funding sources are pretty opaque, but its secretariat organisation is the Together Initiative. Now, this was co-founded by Brendan Cox. He is the husband of the late MP Joe Cox, who was murdered in 2016 by some schizo who shouted, "This is for Brexit." And Joe Cox's sister, Brendan's sister-in-law, is Kim Leadbeater, the MP who put forward the assisted dying bill as a private member's bill sponsored by the assisted dying lobby recently, and she has sort of cloaked herself in her sister's tragic murder so that you can't criticize her, otherwise you're a member of the far right and you're putting her life at risk. So incredibly cynical and incredibly exploitative. The other stakeholders in the ICCC include British Future, which is founded and run by Sundar Katwala, the former General Secretary of the Fabian Society, the socialist group whose emblem is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and also Belong, which call themselves the Cohesion and Integration Network. Now, they contributed to the 2024 Dame Sarah Khan review of social cohesion. And this particular review by Dame Sarah Khan, a name that will come up later, completely omitted the likes of Islamist groups and Black Lives Matter and its various militant anti-white racists as deleterious forces on social cohesion. Instead, it just seemed to blame the far right, as per usual. Now, Katwala, he said the reason he said he's joining is because the Southport riots were a shocking scene of racist disorder we haven't seen in his lifetime. So before they've even engaged in the enterprise of evidence gathering, they have defined a priori those who protested and engaged in violent disorder after the murder of those three girls by second-generation Rwandan Axel Rudakabana in Southport. They have defined them as ontologically evil, and therefore their concerns are all illegitimate. So you know this committee is pervaded by ideology and will not want to revisit the false premises of the immigration and multicultural settlement that led to the state of affairs in the first place, even though a majority of people, when polled by, I think it was Savanta, said that immigration policy was to blame for the Southport riots. And about 46% of people said immigrants themselves and illegal migrants and asylum seekers are to blame for bringing social tensions to this febrile point, which was ignited by this mass atrocity in Southport. Those three organisations, that's Belong, British Future, and Together, they published a report called After the Riots. So this was fresh from Southport, and they recommended a centrally planned national cohesion strategy to build young people's resilience to online misinformation and extremist narratives, for schools and the police to enact a mandate under the Equality Act 2010 to promote cohesion, foster good relations with communities, which basically means giving more money and privileged status to protected characteristics groups, immigrants, non-white minorities, Muslims, and those with unorthodox sexual preferences. And they also said that they called upon the government to reconvene a anti-Muslim hatred working group. So we know, this is the genesis point, why Angela Rayner is now bringing together a group of people like Carrier Sim and Dominic Grieve to redefine Islamophobia and essentially enforce a blasphemy law via state guidance from the top down. And this is after Angela Rayner and the Labour Party in 2019 signed up to the all-party parliamentary group on Islamophobia's definition of Islamophobia, all-party parliamentary group of British Muslims' definition of Islamophobia, which said that Islamophobia is a kind of racism rooted in racism that targets Muslimness and perceived Muslimness, a proper, like Matt Walsh, what is a woman definition of Islamophobia. Islamophobia being a phrase invented by the Muslim Brotherhood, according to Dr. Giles Keppel and an ex-jihadist who was in the meeting, where they said, we need to cloak ourselves in a term that renders us impervious from criticism while we sponsor terror around the globe, that is just as effective as homophobia or anti-Semitism was, which is why you often hear them in the same sentences by demented leftist activists who think that Islam is just one of many religions in a global buffet that you can compartmentalize in your private life and it's just a source for unsubstantiated bigotry by evil straight white male racists. All of this stuff that's going on ever since Southport, the anxiety to control further online speech, the desire to record more non-crime hate incidents, the desire to establish an Islamophobia definition, a lot of this comes from these figures right here. That's Katwala, that's Belong, and British Future, and that's the Together Declaration, and they are the co-sponsoring organisations behind this new ICCC headed by Sajid Javid. Bear in mind, British Future has received over £750,650 in government grants and contracts. Belong have received over £44,000 since 2023. They use that to sponsor Muslim stargazing groups in Rochdale. Yeah, exactly where the grooming gangs have been happening, as well as Gaza and Israel roundtables, and Report with councils in Bradford, Manchester, Calderdale, Kirklees and Walsall, all districts which have been blighted by the Pakistani grooming gangs, on community cohesion, and they're particularly concerned about racism and Islamophobia. So these are all organisations which have contributed to the stultifying climate of censorship, which has put top-down pressure on politicians, the media, local councillors and the British public who have tried to raise concern about the grooming gangs and have felt unable to, and therefore led to riots in largely Labour-controlled areas after the Southport massacre, particularly in Rotherham, where more people have been arrested for participating in the protests and riots than for participating in the grooming gangs. Other members of this committee should ring alarm bells. Dame Sarah Khan, the former government advisor for counter-extremism and the independent advisor for social cohesion and resilience, whose sister ran RICU, the Research, Information and Communications Unit that I've discussed before on this channel, in the Home Office, which is basically their propaganda department, their Don't Look Back in Anger department, which anytime someone reads the Quran a bit too seriously and detonates a nail bomb at a pop concert, or drives a car past the diversity bollards and goes around stabbing people on London or Westminster Bridge, they bus imams out to the site for photo ops, they control the front pages of newspapers, they run prefabricated hashtag campaigns, and they stage events to tell the grieving families, don't look back in anger, or don't hold any hate in your heart for any race or religion. And the perfect example of this was in 2014, when British aid worker Alan Henning was beheaded on video by ISIS. An image appeared on the front page of The Sun of a woman in a Union Jack hijab. This was invented as part of the hashtag Making a Stand campaign by the charity Inspire, in collaboration with Breakthrough Media, who have ties with the Home Office. Inspire was the charity invented by Dame Sarah Khan after she was already working at the Home Office since 2005 on the Community Cohesion Commission after the 7/7 bombings. So Dame Sarah Khan, I mean, she's been accused of being a creature of the Home Office by like Baroness Wolsey before, also someone who has questionable ties to Muslim organisations like MEND, who she herself has said, although they're not illegal, they're illiberal. Dame Sarah Khan has batted off that accusation of being a Home Office stooge, but she's worked for them for about 20 years, and on her watch, Prevent deprioritised monitoring Islamic extremism, even though the number of Islamic terror attacks has increased, and Islamists remain the largest group for MI5 and counter-terror police's watch list. They remain upwards of 60% of terror suspects and convicted terrorists in custody. Despite that, now the far right have more referrals than Islamists, and then the sort of disaggregated, generalized category of mental health and mixed instabilities has become the largest overall referral category, and it's because William Shawcross said that a number of Home Office employees are recalcitrant to admit that there's any connection between Islamic doctrine and Islamic terrorism. In fact, on the website where Prevent defines its terms, where before they've defined cultural nationalism, you know, the belief that mass migration is putting British culture and way of life at threat, where they defined that as a terrorist ideology, which was then condemned by the US State Department. In the same glossary of terms where they say cultural nationalism is a right-wing extremist terror ideology, they emphasize that Islamist terrorism is not to be taken as a representative of Islam. And that's because there is a very large Islamic network, over 700 members, that work within the Home Office. This grew under Khan's watch. Members of this Home Office Islamic network have sat in seminars with King's College London and declared Prevent to be racist because it focuses on Islamist extremism, shortly before pointing and laughing at an ISIS recruitment video and saying, "Hey, I know that terrorist. He used to go to my school. I know him." Other members have recently blocked persecuted Christians fleeing forced conversion from gaining asylum in the country because they have fabricated government documents to say that this country is safe. Recently, there was one member who was convicted for taking bribes to overturn denied asylum applications from Muslims. I think it's from Bangladesh. So he's going to prison. The broader civil service Muslim network have been caught. They were suspended in March 2024 for anti-Semitism and anti-Israel stuff and were reinstated when the Labour government came in September. But members have been caught in seminars saying that the fight between Israel and Gaza is a fight between good and evil. They refer to Israel as Satan. Now again, I'm not Jewish, I've never been to Israel, but I don't think they have great opinions of the native white British host majority over whom they govern, and there are clear conflicts of interest here. All of this grew up under Dame Sarah Khan's watch. Dame Sarah Khan also last December decided to partner with communist organisation Hope Not Hate to produce a paper alleging that Britain faces a chronic risk of democratic decline due to the spread of extremist narratives and conspiracies. They included, by the way, that contemporary far-right narratives on asylum seekers allude to them as Muslim invaders, with small boat crossings being characterised as an invasion of fighting aged men. Apparently that's a conspiracy theory, as is the phrase cultural Marxism, as is Renaud Camus' phrase, which I can't say on YouTube, the large swap, synonym for that, as is also the World Economic Forum's promise of the Great Reset, which, as we know, thanks to FOIs from my friend Lewis Brackpool, the UK government in 2020 were actively collaborating with the World Economic Forum to enact their proposed policies. And, when Klaus Schwab just writes a book titled The Great Reset and then keeps saying we need a Great Reset, turns out the Great Reset is a real thing. But no, they were just gaslighting the entire population using a communist group, which Sarah Khan funded to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds in taxpayers' cash, while she and her sister ran the Home Office. These are the types of people that are running this committee with Sajid Javid. Now, Sajid Javid expressed total apathy in 2021 when news broke that Britain, its largest cities, are becoming minority white English. When Nigel Farage pointed this out, Sajid Javid tweeted out, "So what?" And he's joined in his apathy, by the way, by another member of this committee, our old friend Fraser Nelson, who responded to Matt Goodwin's recent research that said by 2063 the white British will become a minority in their own country by calling it unpalatable nativism. So he's just accusing him of racism, and he was saying, reform will basically become undone and Nigel Farage won't become Prime Minister if you don't keep Zia Yusuf in the party, positioning Zia Yusuf as the heir apparent, because for some strange reason the likes of Fraser Nelson or, let's say, Michael Gove are obsessed with putting their liberal platitudes in the mouth of second-generation or even first-generation immigrants, in the case of Kemi Badenoch, because they believe that only these people can make the case for integration for these febrile tribal minorities who have either apathy, in the case of Sajid Javid, or contempt, in the case of Bob Vylan, for the native British host majority, as long as they remain a majority. Also, it should be noted as well that Sajid Javid's brother, I think it's Baz, also works at the Home Office overseeing immigration. So we've got a sort of family network of second-generation Pakistanis running the British government, and we wonder why levels of Muslim migration remain high. We wonder why the government sets about gaslighting the population about the true nature of Islam anytime a jihadist detonates a nail bomb at a children's pop concert. We wonder why the Home Office has to insist that Islamism has absolutely nothing to do with Islam, but if you read Douglas Murray, watch Great Western Railway Journeys, or enjoy George Orwell's 1984, you're an actively patriotic and proud far-right extremist who should be put on a watch list, which, I remind you, did actually happen. Other members, they include Javid's co-chair, the former Labour Community Secretary, John Cruddas. They include Caroline Lucas, the former co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, who insisted that there is no such thing as an illegal migrant, everyone's an asylum seeker, and all of those should be given blanket citizenship. And they include Sir Andy Street, the former mayor of the West Midlands, who said Birmingham has no no-go zones, even though it was reported literally a year before he said it because of the number of murders that happened in Birmingham. And he said, a lurch to the right on immigration specifically would be really the wrong direction to our current situation after the Conservative Party lost the last election and after he himself lost his seat. This is despite obviously 90% of constituencies in England and Wales wanting immigration reduced when they underestimate the level of net migration by a factor of 10. They think it's 70,000 rather than 700,000. Street just happened to give an interview in May to the New Statesman about where conservatism should lead. And even though immigration is the most prescient issue for everyone in the country, wasn't mentioned once. Also, there's Lord Woolley of Woodford, and he's the founder and director of Operation Black Vote. So literally racially sectarian politics, and we're going to this guy for how we should improve community cohesion. And he was also the chair of the Race Disparity Units Advisory Group. So he is a believer in disparity equals discrimination, which is premised on the false anthropology of the blank slate, which says that literally everyone from anywhere is exactly identical, that all geographic and cultural differences and discrepancies in education and wealth, all inequalities can be ameliorated and eradicated by state intervention, and that literally anyone who passes through the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick and is marinated in the osmotic atoms of British values that just float in the air, that they become indistinguishably as British as you and me. This guy believes that, while also insisting that local councils are not diverse enough. In 2019, he said there was a shocking lack of diversity among local councils, and said, when you have local authorities that are more diverse, more gender, more disabilities, and more minorities, everyone wins because the nature of debate is more inclusive and dynamic. Certainly not the case in Rotherham, Rochdale, Oldham, Bradford, Manchester, any of these places where local councils have made it their mission to, and I quote from the Alexis J report into Rotherham, they've made their number one priority to preserve and enhance the Pakistani heritage community and prioritise that over the safety of white British girls who they allowed to become victims of the Pakistani grooming gangs because they didn't want their reputations to be impugned with accusations of racism. What we're seeing here is an obsession by the ICCC with the second-order concerns, as Douglas Murray would say, of the deleterious impacts of mass immigration and multiculturalism. They will never revisit the mass immigration settlement. Instead, they will only seek to top-down manage, in the manner of Singapore, which Sajid Javid mentioned in his Times piece, the consequences of unwanted, rapid, and unassimilable demographic and cultural change. They are obsessed with, and they list these in their pieces justifying the establishment of the committee, economic hardship, institutional mistrust, and the siloization and misinformation generated by social media. All of those weeds that have sprung up in the infrastructure of the British state had to be first fostered in the fertile soil of irreconcilable religious differences and ethnic tensions, which would not exist if they were not imported in the first place and encouraged by divisive identity politics, a multicultural appeasement strategy, and the lie being told from the highest officers of state, including by Rishi Sunak, who minted the Diversity Built Britain coin, and Michael Gove, who said at the Dispatch box, we're a multi-faith, multinational, multi-ethnic society, and that's the source of our strength. If they had not spread this lie that Britain was a nation of immigrants, we would not have got ourselves in this febrile environment where civil strife is building between the native British and the immigrant populations in the first place. So this is not only a complete waste of money, that's backed, by the way, by, as its various parent organisations are, the NHS, local councils, the National Lottery, Marks and Spencer's, Sainsbury's, PwC, various businesses, charities, and state organisations. So it's clearly just like a shop front for what the state wants the official narrative on Southport to be, as was the Home Affairs Select Committee report, which said there's no such thing as two-tier policing, even though the Constable of West Merseyside Police said she had considered leaking the Rudakabana family's Christian background not to tell the public the truth about his identity, but in her own words, to protect Muslim communities. So even though they admit they're engaging in two-tier policing, they tell us there's no two-tier policing. The purpose of the ICCC, the committee, is not only to launder the state's preferred narrative through the pretense of neutrality and impartiality, but it is also a wholly insufficient response to the cataclysm that awaits us if we remain on rails on the course towards this hypothetical settlement, towards a multicultural utopia. Immigration isn't working. Integration isn't happening. As Fraser Nelson said, it's not a miracle. The Boris wave is not an accident, as Nelson said again. You know, 1 million Indians weren't blown to our shores by a weather event over the course of 4 years. If we still get the likes of, as he had a pop at me on Twitter last week, Michael Gove, insisting that the Michaela School is basically a model for how the British state should be run, that there is no such thing as a distinct English ethnic identity, as both Nelson and Gove have said. If you can reduce being British down to a set of universal platitudes like a fondness for the rule of law, fairness and tolerance, as if we're playing one big cricket game, if we continue to indulge in this dangerous delusion and don't revisit the root causes of this unwanted and avoidable racial and religious division, which is threatening to tear our country apart, then we will get, as David Betts and Dominic Cummings have warned, civil war. And it's entirely avoidable. I don't want thousands of people to be injured and dead. I don't want people storming the conspicuously new gates that have been put around the Palace of Westminster and the House of Lords recently. We all know why they're there. It's because they fear what will happen. It was only recently, it was late 2023, when the vote on a ceasefire in Parliament happened, and a giant mob gathered outside during the vote to pressure MPs to vote for it and broadcast from the river to the sea on the Elizabeth Tower, housing the bell of Big Ben, the big clock faces attached to Parliament. And Sir Lindsay Hoyle was petrified that MPs would be murdered, like Sir David Amess or Joe Cox were. If we don't change the settlement right now, if we don't stop telling ourselves these lies, that Britain is a nation of immigrants, that diversity is our strength, that assimilation is working, that we can all be run according to one big Michaela School, if we don't stop telling ourselves these lies, the predictable and preventable consequences of David Betts and Dominic Cummings' warnings of civil war will happen. And we don't want this. But we are what we continually do, and I don't listen to what a person says all the time. I listen to what they do. Their actions are what they truly believe. And so I can only infer that if the elite have been warned that this is the inevitable consequence, and they stick their heads in the sand like ostriches and ignore all this evidence anyway, that they either want this state of affairs, or they're at least not prepared to do what is necessary to prevent the state of affairs from coming to pass. And so they're just sleepwalking us into Lebanon or South Africa or Liberia. And this is why I've been hammering so hard on this point, is because my conscience plagues me to solve this problem, to participate in the solution to this problem, in any way that I can, before it's far too late. And the ICCC, this, yet again, non-independent state front that just gives jobs to people who have brought Britain to the brink of civil war without ever examining their priors, this just isn't good enough. And so I will be looking at its output, I will be reporting on this, and we can't let them get away with rewriting history in this fashion and using the Southport riots and the imprisonment of people who expressed their outrage on social media, like Wayne O'Rourke, Judy Sweeney, Lucy Connolly, and the late Peter Lynch. We can't allow them to use this as yet more fodder for manufacturing consent to censor public discontent, engage in the downgrading of status of the white British in their own country, continue with mass immigration even though it has no democratic consent and never has, and continue to crowbar apart the settled British identities that comprise this land and made it great to encompass its antagonistic antonyms, and say that even though the likes of Bob Vylan, who are gloating that they've stolen this country from us and are open about hating us, to say that he is as indistinguishably British as you and me. It's just not true, and telling ourselves these lies will not solve the problem. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. I'll be back next week, and then I'll be taking at least a week's break because I'll be in America at a conference and on Tim Pool's show. Until then, take care and goodbye.